Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. You know we love unearthing these hidden gems in your reading material. And have you ever wished you could just soak up a whole book's worth of knowledge, but while you're doing your daily commute or even just tackling those chores? Well, today we're going to check out a way to do just that.
We're going deep on mindful moments. Nourish your mind on the go. Now just imagine for a second. Imagine an expert boiling down a whole book, narrating it with AI, and then delivering it to you in these really easily digestible pieces, no more towering to read piles or feeling guilty.
It's like having
your
own personal Cliff Notes, but way cooler and obviously powered by AI. So to show you how this works, we're going to take you on a little journey through a book that covers a whole century of history, modern times the world, from the 20s to the 90s by Paul Johnson.
Yeah, it's a big one. It's a sweeping historical survey that takes you through wars and revolutions and cultural shifts. And Johnson, he's known for his engaging, sometimes even provocative style, so buckle up.
All right, so let's unpack this thing. What are some of the big takeaways that stood out to you from the book?
One of the things I thought was really striking was how Johnson analyzes the Treaty of Versailles, the one that was signed after World War I. Now he argues that the treaty, while it's understandable from the victor's perspective, it actually backfired. The harsh terms that were imposed on Germany created this resentment, and it ultimately laid the groundwork for, future conflict.
That's really interesting because even the source material mentioned disagreements about the treaty, but among the victors themselves, for example, the U.S. Secretary of State Lansing thought that excluding Germany from the negotiations was a big mistake.
Exactly. And this is what sets the stage for Johnson's exploration of how these seemingly decisive actions can have these unforeseen consequences. It makes you think about the ripple effects of decisions, particularly after a war.
Yeah, and the source material also mentioned this idea of a will of power replacing religious impulses in the modern world. That really piqued my interest.
Well, that is a key theme in the book. Johnson draws heavily on Nietzsche's ideas, arguing that the decline of traditional religious beliefs created a void that was filled by these powerful and often dangerous secular ideologies, like fascism and communism.
And those ideologies gave rise to some of the most influential figures of the 20th century, like Lenin, Mussolini, and Hitler.
Exactly. Johnson dives deep into their personalities, their motivations, their strategies. He shows how they amassed and wielded power, often through propaganda and even terror.
It's crazy because the sources even mentioned that some of Lenin's closest allies criticized his authoritarian tendencies. And, he quickly dismantled any semblance of democracy once the Bolsheviks gained power.
That's right. Johnson meticulously documents the rise of the Cheka, that was the Bolshevik secret police, and how Lenin fostered a culture of fear and violence, for example. Even before the Russian Civil War was in full swing, Lenin advocated for the execution of anyone deemed an enemy of the state.
It's really scary how fast revolutionary ideals can turn into state-sponsored terror.
And Johnson doesn't stop there. He also examines Mussolini's rise to power in Italy, exposing how even a seemingly charismatic figure could become brutally oppressive once in control.
And all of this was unfolding against a backdrop of growing disillusionment, particularly in Germany, where people felt betrayed by their leaders and even the cultural elite.
Right, and this feeling of resentment, fueled by economic hardship and a sense of cultural vulnerability that's really crucial to understanding the rise of Nazism. Many Germans felt like their culture was under attack, and they yearned for a strong leader who could restore the nation to its former glory.
And that's where Hitler enters the picture, right? The source material mentioned how he was like a master of spectacle and propaganda.
Absolutely. He understood how to manipulate the masses. He drew inspiration from theatrical techniques and even borrowed from the very cultural figures that he condemned.
It's terrifying how these totalitarian regimes blended spectacle with fear, creating this powerful and seductive appeal. For so many, they controlled not just physical space, but also the ideas circulating within society.
Yeah, and this control extended beyond well-known figures like Hitler and Stalin. Johnson explores the rise of totalitarian regimes in other parts of the world too, like Japan.
The sources describe how Japan's rapid modernization, while it brought progress, also fueled this yearning for traditional values and a rise in intense nationalism. It's almost paradoxical.
It is. And Johnson points out these paradoxes. For instance, he details an incident where followers of an ultra-nationalist, totalitarian form of Shinto publicly burned books that were advocating for individual rights.
That's a stark example of how these regimes tried to control the very fabric of thought. It's a reminder that the fight for freedom and individual rights requires constant vigilance.
And that vigilance becomes even more important as we look at the events. Leading up to World War II, it's really a period marked by miscalculations and missed opportunities. It's like a slow-motion train wreck that you can't look away from.
Yeah, the source material really highlights like all those missteps. It's like watching a disaster unfold, knowing you can't do anything to stop it.
Exactly. Johnson really dissects those appeasement policies of Britain and France, showing how their desire to avoid another war, understandable as it was, inadvertently emboldened Hitler and gave him the space to push his ambitions even further.
Yeah, and the sources also mentioned Stalin's miscalculations too. Despite all those warnings about Hitler's intentions, he seemed to think he could just, like, strike a deal with the Nazis and avoid being drawn into the conflict.
Stalin's miscalculation is one of the biggest turning points of the 20th century. His obsession with consolidating power blinded him to what Hitler really wanted, the Nazi-Soviet pact. That was intended as a strategic maneuver. It backfired spectacularly. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941,
The sources described how Stalin, even as the invasion began, he was in denial. It took him weeks to actually address the Soviet people and rally them to defend their homeland.
it's a chilling example of how ideology can distort reality, even for someone as ruthless as Stalin. And the human cost of his misjudgment was immeasurable.
It's really incredible how close the Soviet Union came to collapse. In those first few months of the war, the sources describe Stalin like remaining in Moscow, projecting strength, even as the German troops were closing in.
It was a gamble that ultimately paid off, but it really shows the sacrifices made by the Soviet people. Their resilience, along with the brutal Russian winter, helped turn the tide of the war.
But even as his country was fighting for survival, Stalin never let up on his use of terror to maintain control.
That's what's so chilling about totalitarian regimes. Fear is their most potent weapon. Even as the German era was at the gates of Moscow, Stalin was purging his own military, executing those he saw as disloyal. He even imprisoned the families of soldiers who surrendered, sending a message about any perceived weakness.
I can't even imagine what it must have been like for those people, facing annihilation from one side and fearing their own government on the other.
They endured, showing extraordinary courage and resilience. Johnson acknowledges their sacrifices, reminding us that the victory over Nazi Germany came at a cost that few in the West can really understand.
And the war wasn't only fought on the Eastern Front. Johnson also takes us to the Pacific Theater, where Japan made its own gamble for empire.
The attack on Pearl Harbor is a classic example of miscalculation. Japan thought a surprise attack would cripple the American fleet and secure their dominance in the Pacific. But they underestimated the resolve of the American people and the industrial might of the United States.
Yeah, it seems like from the source material that even as defeat was looming, Japan's leaders still thought they could negotiate a peace settlement that would preserve their empire.
It speaks to the power of ideology to distort judgment. Japan's leadership, they were steeped in their own propaganda and belief, in their own invincibility. They just couldn't grasp the reality of their situation. They held on to hope long after it was clear that the Allies wouldn't accept anything but unconditional surrender.
The sources even mention how the emperor, despite being seen as a divine figure, had very little power to actually influence the course of events.
That's a really important point, because it challenges our perception of Japan as this like monolithic emperor-worshipping society. The reality was far more complex, with different factions all vying for power. The emperor, while a revered symbol, often played a passive role, just kind of rubber-stamping decisions made by others.
It's fascinating how Johnson explores all the cultural and ideological factors that contributed to Japan's militarism and their ultimately disastrous decision to go to war with the United States.
He argues that Japan's rapid modernization, while it brought about advancements, it also fueled this sense of national anxiety, this fear of being left behind. And this anxiety, combined with a deeply ingrained sense of cultural superiority, created an environment where militaristic solutions seemed not just appealing, but necessary.
The sources even described how some in Japan saw the war as a way to purify their society, to get rid of Western influences and restore those traditional values. It's a recurring theme, isn't it? This desire to return
to a mythical past. It is. And it fuels the most destructive impulses. It reminds us that these ideologies can transcend national borders. They find fertile ground in societies struggling with change and with deep-seated insecurities.
And those insecurities weren't confined to the Axis powers. The sources detail how the U.S. and the Soviet Union engaged in this global struggle for dominance. After World War II, what came to be known as the Cold War
The Cold War was a conflict unlike any other, a clash of ideologies.
Right.
With both sides having nuclear weapons, capable of unimaginable destruction. It was a period of paranoia, espionage, and proxy wars where it felt like the fate of humanity was hanging in the balance.
One of the things that really got me in the source material was how both sides developed these elaborate plans for nuclear war. Scenarios that involved just unimaginable levels of destruction.
It's scary to think how close we came to annihilation. During the Cold War, nuclear weapons changed everything about warfare. But despite the risks, both sides kept building up their arsenals, convinced that their survival depended on maintaining that nuclear deterrent.
The sources described how even as they engaged in arms control talks, they were simultaneously developing new and more deadly weapons, pushing the world closer and closer to the brink.
It was a dangerous game of chicken, each side trying to outmaneuver the other, terrified of appearing weak. And in many ways, it's a game that's still being played today, as the threat of nuclear proliferation continues.
It's hard to believe how much of the world was caught up in the Cold War, both superpowers vying for influence in Asia, Africa, Latin America.
The Cold War was truly global, reaching every corner of the planet. Proxy wars erupted in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, each one a tragic example of how this ideological struggle played out on a global stage.
One of the things I found really interesting was how Johnson argued that the Cold War actually helped to sustain the global economic order in the decades after World War II. It seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does, but it makes sense when you think about the dynamics of the conflict. The need to contain communism, to present a united front against the Soviet Union created a strong incentive for the Western powers to cooperate economically. The Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods system, institutions like the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund all contributed to this period of unprecedented economic growth and stability in the West.
The sources even mention how that Cold War competition spurred all this innovation and technological advancement, both sides investing heavily in research and development, trying to gain an edge in the arms race and in that broader struggle for global dominance.
It's a classic example of how competition, even when it's driven by fear and distrust, can drive progress. The space race came directly from this rivalry, leading to breakthroughs we still benefit from today. But of course, there was a dark side, fueling that nuclear arms race, keeping the world on edge for decades.
It's a reminder that even the most destructive conflicts can have unintended positive consequences, but it's also a warning about letting those rivalries spiral out of control.
And that's where Johnson's nuance, as a historian, really stands out. He doesn't shy away from those complexities. He acknowledges the good and the bad, the progress and the peril of the Cold War era. It's a thought-provoking perspective on how that period shaped the world we live in today.
Speaking of shaping the world, Johnson also delves into the process of decolonization as empires crumbled and these new nations emerged on the global stage. It was a period of just immense change and upheaval.
It was. The dismantling of colonial empires was one of the most significant developments of the 20th century. It led to the birth of so many new countries and a fundamental reordering of global power, but it was also a process full of challenges as former colonies struggled to establish stable governments and navigate this new world of international relations.
And the sources described how the Cold War often became entangled in these independence movements, the U.S. and the Soviet Union both, vying for influence, turning these struggles for self-determination into proxy conflicts.
It's a recurring theme throughout history. As empires crumble, new power struggles emerge. The Cold War cast a long shadow over the decolonization era, shaping the destinies of millions and often making existing tensions even worse.
One of the things I found interesting was Johnson's critique of how the emphasis on political forms during decolonization kind of paved the way for exploitation and instability in many of these newly formed nations. It's a perspective that challenges a lot of conventional wisdom.
It does. He argues that the focus on establishing these very specific political structures, often modeled on Western democracies, without addressing the underlying social and economic realities, created an environment where corruption and authoritarian rule could thrive.
The sources even mention how this rush to establish new states, based solely on those political forms, led to the rise of what he calls professional politicians, individuals more concerned with power than with serving the needs of their people.
And these professional politicians, often lacking experience or any real commitment to democratic values, they exploited ethnic and tribal divisions, manipulated elections, and resorted to authoritarian tactics to hold on to power. It's a cautionary tale about prioritizing form over substance, imposing abstract models without considering the specific contexts and challenges of different societies.
It reminds us that building a just and equitable world requires more than just redrawing borders or creating new political institutions. It means addressing the root causes of poverty, inequality, and injustice. And it requires a commitment to upholding fundamental human rights and democratic values.
Yeah, it really makes you think about, the long-term impact of those decisions, right?
It does. It makes you wonder how different things might have been if the victors after World War I had taken a more nuanced and forward-looking approach.
It's one of those big what-ifs that historians love to think about. And it highlights Johnson's point that the past isn't just something to be studied, it's something to learn from. If we understand the mistakes of those who came before us, maybe we can avoid repeating them.
And Johnson doesn't just look at the political and economic connections. He also explores how technology and cultural shifts and even intellectual trends can have those ripple effects too.
Right. He reminds us that we're all connected in these systems, where seemingly isolated events can trigger these chain reactions with really far-reaching consequences. It encourages us to think more holistically about the challenges we face and consider the long-term impact of our actions.
One of the things that really stood out to me was Johnson's discussion of how technological innovations, while they're often seen as progress, can also have these unintended consequences.
He argues that technology is a double-edged sword. It can improve our lives, solve problems, create new possibilities, but it can also amplify our destructive tendencies, make inequalities worse, and even threaten our existence.
The sources gave a pretty chilling example of that. With the development of nuclear weapons, intended as a deterrent, they ushered in this era of unprecedented risk and the constant threat of total annihilation. It's a reminder that we have to be careful not to become slaves to our own inventions.
It's a theme that's even more relevant today, with AI and biotechnology and all these other powerful technologies that could reshape our world. Johnson's insights are a good reminder to approach these innovations with caution, to use their power for good, while also protecting ourselves from their potential for harm.
It makes you wonder what Johnson would say about the challenges we face in the 21st century. After a century filled with upheavals and horrors and triumphs, where do we go from here?
That's the big question, isn't it? Johnson doesn't give us a clear answer, but he gives us a way to understand the past and to deal with the present. He reminds us that history isn't just a straight line. It's a mix of choices and actions and reactions, and that we have the power to shape the future by the choices we make today.
That's a message that I find both empowering and a little scary. Yeah. Empowering because it reminds us that we're not just watching history happen, but we're a part of it. And scary because it makes us face the responsibility that comes with that power.
Exactly. Johnson challenges us to engage with history, not just as spectators, but as active learners, trying to understand the patterns, the ways power can be misused, the appeal of ideologies, and the importance of individual rights and freedoms.
He wants us to be aware of the forces shaping our world, to recognize the potential for both good and bad, and to make choices that will lead to a better future.
And that's why books like Modern Times are so important. They help us understand the 20th century and offer insights into the challenges we face today.
If you're feeling overwhelmed by how much there is to learn, that's where Mindful Moments can help. They have this incredible AI-narrated version of Modern Times that makes all of this complex material way more accessible.
It's like having your own personal historian, guiding you through the 20th century, highlighting the key moments, explaining what they mean, and helping you see the connections. And you can do all of this while you're going for a walk, folding laundry, or commuting to work.
It's about making the most of your time. No more letting those books just sit on your shelf. Mindful Moments lets you learn on your own terms, fitting knowledge into your busy life.
It's about making learning a habit, not a chore.
So if you're ready to dive into Modern Times and experience the power of AI-narrated learning, we highly recommend checking out Mindful Moments.
You can find a link to buy the AI-narrated version in the show notes.
And don't forget to subscribe to Mindful Moments to unlock a whole library of knowledge, all curated and condensed for your on-the-go lifestyle.
So until next time, keep those minds curious.
We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.